2023 Atlantic hurricane season, the comprehensive drought management initiatives, state of readiness in respect of infrastructure from the NWA, and also seismic readiness. Prime Minister, we have taken apologies from ministers and permanent secretaries and other members of the council. And at this time, it is my pleasure to hand over to the Deputy Chairman of Council, the Honorable Desmond Mackenzie, who will do the necessary tabling of reports.
Thank you, PS. Honorable Prime Minister, let me welcome you officially to this session. Before I get into the presentation of the documents, I want to spend a couple of minutes in addressing two issues that involves the operation of the municipal corporations and the general state of concern that as Minister with responsibility for local government that has been worrying me, and even more so today. As you are aware, there was a massive fire at the Musgrave Market in Portland over the weekend. A significant portion of the market was destroyed by fire, with close to 170 vendors being affected by the fire. The fire also did extensive damage to private buildings in close proximity to the market. The investigations are on in earnest. The insurance company, I want to advise the public that the market is fully insured. The insurance company has been on the location. I've gotten a partial report from the Jamaica Fire Brigade. I am not going to give details of that report yet until it is fully finalized. The government is cognizant of the challenges facing vending across the country. This morning, I got a call from the Commissioner of the Jamaica Fire Brigade to advise me that fire was set to the Linstead Market, and this was done deliberately by persons for reasons best known. Stalls were destroyed and other areas of the market was affected. I want to use this forum to say to the country that our markets is one of the greatest contributors to the economy of Jamaica. There are some 35 markets across the country. Many of these markets were built more than 100 years old. Our markets have been the source of substance to many Jamaicans, taking them through university. Many leaders in this country, their parents, mothers, 90% of those who sell in the markets are females. And when we deliberately set fire to our public institutions, then it is cause for concern. The Member of Parliament for Portland East and Portland West, Minister Vaz and his wife, who is the MP for East Portland, I want to commend them because as I speak, they are in Portland giving an assurance of a collective response to the plight of the vendors in Musgrave Market in Portland. The Ministry of Local Government will release $10 million from the Equalization Fund to the Portland Municipal Corporation to commence cleanup exercise and to provide a temporary market facility for the butchers in the parish once the Public Health Department has signed off on the area. We're going to be looking at ways of strengthening the market, and I must say, ladies and gentlemen, that it was just 3 years ago we spent some $15 million renovating the Musgrave Market. 3 years ago we spent over $15 million on that market. I want to assure the vendors in Port Antonio of the government's commitment to ensure that we restore as best as possible the market. We are working with a private sector company through the kind assistance of Minister Vaz to come up with a concept for the market that will allow much more space and allow vending to be done in an orderly fashion. The issue in Linstead, I hope the police will do the necessary investigations, but the government will not bow to any pressure from any source at all who want to use any means at their disposal in order to eat a food. When you burn a market, you burn the livelihood of hundreds of Jamaicans, and we are not going to allow anyone over the last year and a half, we have had 17 fires in markets across the country. 17 fires, which has cost the ministry in excess of $100 million in helping to put back these markets back in working condition. I urge those who continue to be indisciplined, who have no vested interest in the future of this country, to desist. Ladies and gentlemen, I now want to present to the Council the report of a working session of the Disaster Risk Management Council, which I chaired last week in this same room. Earlier on in the presentation by the Acting Director General, he spoke to some of what came out of that meeting, and also to have the minutes of a meeting of June 15, 2022 be ratified. So I am now putting the minutes, and I would ask for the floor to formally accept the minutes. Do I have a mover? Moved by the Mayor of Port Maria, of Morant Bay, Councillor Mayor Williams, and seconded by the Mayor of Portmore, Councillor Mayor Leon Thomas. Why? I'm sorry, you weren't in the job last year, so you can't. You just got to work the other day. So you can't. Do I have a mover? Move, you were here last year? The Commissioner of Fire was present, so the Commissioner moved, and seconded by Mayor of Portmore, Mayor Leon Thomas. The amendments and the necessary adjustments has been taken, and these documents now form a part of this year's agenda going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time it is my distinct pleasure and honor to invite the chairman of the National Disaster Risk Management Council, Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, to come now and to deliver his charge. Let's welcome the Most Honorable Prime Minister.
Good morning, everyone. Allow me to part with salutations. We meet here each year to review our plans to ensure that we are ready should we be hit by a natural disaster, particularly a natural disaster of a national scale. It is an important meeting each year because it sets the tone for the government. And that tone is preparedness. If we fail to plan, then you know the other side of that equation. And failure is not an option. So I don't need to go any further in my speech, Minister. I could take my seat. An important element of organization is to bring the people who occupy the functions to what is called a mind share. The government of Jamaica, like any other government, is complex with many different functions held and executed by many different people with diverse outlooks, different motivations. But for the organization to work on a common challenge, such as a natural disaster, all its leaders, in particular, must be of a shared mind. And so the purpose of this gathering is, as you would have seen in its structure, that the leaders are able to share their plans, share their policies, share their concerns and challenges, and to share strategies to overcome them. Now, fire has their own set of plans and strategies. The NWA, they have their own set of plans, challenges, and strategies to overcome. All organizations the NSWMA, you know. But no one entity can respond wholly and solely to a natural disaster that is on a national scale. The entire government has to respond. And therefore, we meet like this so that we can understand what each other is doing and integrate some of that knowledge into what we are doing. And for a very simple reason as well. We need to know each other. Even just a first visual identification at the leadership level. We often take it for granted that we are all in the same government. We should know each other. Sometimes that is not the case. Positions change all the time. People who hold these positions, they get promoted out. They move laterally to other positions, or they leave the organization. So we need to, at least once a year, meet to see each other. And one would also hope that when we gather for lunch or we gather at the provisions for break, that we get to know each other as well, and just from a social perspective, because that eases the potential obstacles that could exist in an emergency when tensions are high and people have to dispense with diplomacy and courtesies, that we know each other. Minister, why are you recording me? So this meeting is very important on several levels to get us prepared. And I came to that conclusion, that understanding, when the pandemic hit. Minister, you will recall us calling together, and all entities of government would have been required to play some part in the pandemic response. So I just thought I would set that context. Now, Jamaica, like many Caribbean countries, we are extremely vulnerable to natural disasters, and the human and economic costs are substantial. According to the International Monetary Fund, Jamaica's exposure to natural disasters rank in the top 20 globally. And this is primarily due to our low-lying coastal zones, which is where most of our population exists, and our 5 major fault lines. And I was very, very pleased to see the presentation from the seismic unit. It gave me a sense of comfort, of relief, that we do have some capacity in monitoring seismic action in Jamaica. Maybe not at the capacity and level that we would want, but certainly we do have capacity. Now, Jamaica has withstood approximately 40 natural disasters of a national scale between 1950 and 2017. And that would be about 1 disaster per year. 60% of these were hurricanes and storms. And these storms were accompanied by significant flooding, droughts was another severe droughts, another feature of our disaster profile, and epidemics, another feature of our disaster profile. In fact, floods, droughts, and epidemics accounted for about 40% of our natural disaster profiles since our independence in 1962. Now, adequate procedures to deal with disaster situations and relief measures must be planned well in advance of the actual disaster event. Starting with, of course, strong and effective legislation. And the legislation is necessary to ensure that the various leaders of the disaster response are clear on their roles and responsibilities and their duties in law. What you wouldn't want to happen in a disaster is for someone to be saying, this is not my role, it's your role. That would be the start of another disaster. One thing we can then be proud of is that we do have a very well-structured legislative framework to manage disasters. And in fact, our gathering here is as a result of the requirement in our legislation. So we are fulfilling the legislative framework to execute our response. So one, all of you here who are leaders will lead the disaster response. You know what your responsibility is. But more than that, everyone else knows what your responsibility is. So in a disaster, there can be no passing off of responsibilities, because legislatively we have settled that. But the legislation also calls for us to build a community understanding, which is separate and apart from what is legislated. This community understanding is that all the leaders are together, they share the perspective of the response, and they are motivated to respond, which is the purpose of this gathering. So, careful planning must be put in place to coordinate the use of resources, both human and physical, and for saving and sustaining life, and the protection of property and infrastructure. But there is a word that has become very well used in our vocabulary these days, and that is called resilience. So the purpose of preparedness is to recover quickly. So in our framework, legislatively, and in terms of our organizational posture, is that we expect that there will be a disaster. Right? We expect it. We don't know when it is going to happen, but we have put in place various systems to help us to monitor, to track data, and to predict. And having experienced disasters before, we know how to pre-position for disasters. And putting all those together, the collection of data, the legislative framework, the ability to predict, to pre-position our responses, that will help us to recover from the disruption and dislocation of a natural disaster when it happens. And the idea is not just to recover, but to recover quickly. And of course, we have added some things to it, recover stronger, which we have done from the COVID-19 pandemic. We have recovered stronger, without question. Thank you, Minister, thank you. Now, the varying hazards have impacted countries all over the world, but the impacts have been greater on small developing states, in particular small island developing states. And not only has the impact been greater, but the frequency of disasters have been greater on small island developing states. And I want you to consider this. When Katrina hit the United States, did it shut down their economy? There was a small impact on their national economy. But look at the dislocation at the hurricane that hit Antigua and Barbuda. I believe it was in 2018. It wiped out their entire economy. When Hurricane Gilbert hit us in 1988, it wiped out 30% of our GDP. So you can see that the risk of disaster to a small developing country, particularly a small island developing state, is far more significant in its disruptive nature than it is to larger countries. So the lesson from that is that we need to take planning for natural disasters far more seriously, because the impact to us is existential. Meaning, a natural disaster could potentially wipe out the country. So this is how seriously I would want all the leaders of the various entities that are critical to the national response to treat disasters. That's how important you are to the process of responding to disasters and ensuring our resilience, our ability to recover. Now, in addition to the conventional responses to natural disasters, making sure fire, police, military, your works entities, your Central Organization for Disaster Response, or ODPEM, all the other entities that are critical to a disaster response. In addition to that, what we have noticed, and particularly for resilience, is that the Ministry of Finance is actually a very critical entity in disaster response. Absolutely critical. There's a dimension to disaster response which is called financing. Our Minister of Education is saying rapid financing. But I want to just transition your mind a bit. Disaster financing is critical. Now, disaster financing, it's not financing when a disaster hits. That's not what it is. And traditionally, what we have done is to believe we can self-insure, meaning that, well, if a disaster hits, then all we do is to reallocate from existing needs and spend on recovering from the disaster. But in countries like Jamaica that are constantly facing disasters, what happens? The disasters impact your GDP significantly, reduces your productivity, which reduces your fiscal wherewithal, the ability to finance public expenditure. And then you end up doing what? You end up borrowing. So, yes, a large part of Jamaica's debt situation was because of profligacy in our own public finance management. But another part of it was that we were impacted almost on a yearly basis by a natural disaster, for which we did not plan financially. So we have taken, this administration, we have taken a different approach to disaster risk management, particularly on the financial side of things. And in fact, we have developed the National Natural Disaster Risk Financing Policy, which there was quite a significant process of consultation. I'm certain that almost everyone in here participated in some way in the development of that policy or contributed to that policy. So we have developed this policy, and it has guided us in what we have done in terms of our approach to disaster risk management. For the first time, we have created buffers within our budget so that we are able to respond to natural disasters. Our response to the COVID-19 pandemic was very quick, very effective, and we were able to recover very quickly and much stronger than we were before because we had buffers. We had financial buffers. We actually took out of the budget and made provisions for the establishment of a fund. So we did not have to borrow. Now, for the average Jamaican, this is like, so what? But this was such a fundamental change in how the Jamaican economy responded. If we were hit by the COVID pandemic in the 90s or the early 2000s, what would have been our situation? I'm saying this because it is important that the country appreciates positive change that is happening right before your very eyes, that you may not see it in that context. But Jamaica today is a much stronger Jamaica than it was a decade ago. And I give you a little, perspective. We had an epidemic in 2014. That was the chikungunya, chickpea. You recall that? And that was really just minor compared to COVID. And you recall that for a couple of days, almost all public offices were shut down because people were, infected and had to stay home. And the impact that had on our economy. And of course, there were issues about how the government should respond to this, or could the government respond? There was literal panic. Other people may not remember this, but I just thought I would bring it back into public consciousness. But, compare that small, relatively small health scare to the COVID pandemic and how the government was able to respond. Primarily because our fiscal situation was different. Now, in line with our new policy of disaster risk financing, in 2021, Jamaica became the first country in the Caribbean, and certainly the first small island developing state, to issue or sponsor a catastrophe bond. The bond is effective up to, it is for 3 Atlantic tropical cyclone cycles, so that would end in December 2023. And in the event of an event that qualifies for payout, Jamaica would be protected up to US $185 million in rapid response in terms of financing. So we are not only building the fiscal buffer, we are also getting insurance basically in place to ensure that if something were to happen, we could respond fairly rapidly. And that is resilience building. That is resilience building. However, it does not mean that we should be profligate. In other words, we must manage the disaster such that we don't spend what we don't need to spend. So I just thought I would bring this within, our domain of understanding. So we appreciate the various dimensions of the government's policy for being able to respond to disaster and give confidence to the public regarding the continuity of business in Jamaica. Now, I have to do this part of my presentation. It is very important as I now turn to our preparedness for our hurricane season. Now, I say to the general public, in the event of a disaster, whether it be a hurricane or, God forbid, any other disaster, plan your evacuation route well ahead of time. If you live on the coast or in a low-lying area, you may have to evacuate in the event of a major storm or hurricane. While you will undoubtedly get instructions from ODPEM and the Met Office, they usually send out these warnings over public transmissions, you need to create your own evacuation plan well in advance of a disaster strike, so that you will know very quickly what is not just your route, but how you're going to utilize that route. So I'm therefore making the appeal for Jamaicans living in low-lying areas of our coastal zones. Make your evacuation plans early. A hurricane, while you may be given a day or two notice, when it actually happens, the surges can move very quickly. If there, God forbid, if there is an earthquake, you are on a low-lying area, tsunamis are a possibility, and they happen very quickly. So I'm urging all Jamaicans, as a part of our preparedness, bring your family together and say, all right, if this were to happen, which is the best route we should take? And where is the best place for shelter? So you want to know where would be the approved shelters of the government, and those would be very easy to ascertain. ODPEM always has a list of shelters. You know that schools in the area are usually used as shelters. But sometimes you may want to also say, all right, I have my uncle that lives up in the hill, and so I might have to get to him. And so you might want to call him up and say, you have that room ready for me? This is a part of your evacuation plan. You always need to have some emergency supplies on hand. In today's economy, it's difficult sometimes for some households to buy more than they need, especially households who are on limited income or no income at all, and they live from day to day. But for those of you who can, and even for those of you who can't, it is absolutely important that you put aside even 2 or 3 days of food supplies. Make sure you have water, some amount of canned food, some amount of dried foods that can last without refrigeration. Put together a small emergency first aid kit. And I'm not saying that you must go out and buy an elaborate toolbox with all kinds of first aid and medical supplies. Make sure you have your basics. You have some Band-Aid, alcohol, Come, Minister, help me. Tell me all the things you would want. You put in your flashlight. Yes. Yes, if you have medication that you have to take, make sure that you have those supplies. So all of you know what to do. So why we don't do it? But I'm urging all Jamaicans to start to think in this way as we approach the hurricane season. Of course, you want to make sure that you can secure your critical documents. So Ziploc bags are very effective, a simple way of protecting them from water and other hazards. So you might want to start to look at how you can secure your critical documents. Now, not many people, insure their property. But again, in terms of our financial readiness, this is something that we ought to look at. So I'm encouraging Jamaicans to explore the options that are available for insurance financing for your property, and to ensure that if you do get insurance, that it is adequate. Because sometimes people take out insurance and they find that it is inadequate. So make sure that if you decide to do that, your insurance is adequate. And for those of you who have insurance, it is always a good idea to check now to make sure that what you originally contracted to is presently sufficient for recovery. Then I would say take steps to protect your home and valuable properties. So if you live very close to a storm drain or a gully, you want to make sure that your parish council is aware if the invert is undermined or if a tree is growing in the gully that could potentially block the flow, that could create flooding. You need to be proactive in this regard to make sure that any infrastructure, civil infrastructure that is close to your home that could create a problem for your home, that you are proactive in ensuring that those are addressed. In today's world, where we are very pro strategies for climate change, I am not encouraging the cutting of trees. However, if there is a tree that could pose a threat to your home, you should take steps to, as much as possible, ensure that you preserve the tree, but that the tree does not destroy your home. So you figure that one out. So it might mean you have to limit, but you wouldn't take that decision lightly, right? And of course, if it is close to power lines, you would want to inform the utility company of the threat that the tree poses. If you are currently building, ensure that you are following the building codes. Our building codes are, I would say, one of the strongest in the region. Yes. Since Hurricane Gilbert, everybody is using a slab roof instead of a zinc roof, and people, our building culture is to overbuild. So we have invested heavily in concrete and steel. There's no question in my mind about that. But still, if you have timber roofs, ensure that you put on your hurricane straps. All right, just that simple action alone could save you significantly. an important part of your building is to make sure that your structure assists in your sustainability. So yes, in a hurricane you have a deluge of water, but after the hurricane is over, you are likely not to have potable water. So you have to, in building, ensure that you have your building captures water and can store water. So my encouragement to all Jamaicans is to have your water sustainability strategy integrated into your housing strategy. And we are moving in that direction. We will be giving out several thousands of tanks to households that are assessed to be in need. And we will be building out a strategy for catchment, which would help to convert some of those tanks into rainwater harvesting strategies. So we're doing our part, and we encourage all Jamaicans to do their part. So with those encouragements, I bring my presentation to a close and to repeat that as leaders, you are absolutely important in our national response. The national response must be unified. The national response must be in keeping with our legislative framework. And you, as leaders, must be motivated enough, informed enough, and strategic enough to bring our national plan to fruition in terms of a response. Now, once we get the leadership level right, then the resource mobilization element of the response will be there in tandem to support you, as I have outlined, that through the Ministry of Finance, we have developed our disaster risk financing strategy. So we will have the leadership together, you will have the resources together, and in terms of the human resources, the leadership resource is critical to give direction and leadership. I've seen our mobilization at work, and it requires long hours. Sometimes you have to be away from your home. In other words, in the disaster, you have to leave your family to man stations to ensure that other families are protected. That doesn't happen if within the organization there is dissonance. That when the leader of the organization picks up the phone to call the subordinate to say, listen, we need you here, and the subordinate just say, I never see that call. But if we are all of a mind share where we understand the importance of our role, you don't have to worry about that. So if the leader of the organization picked up the phone and didn't say good morning or good afternoon, it's not an issue. Because you realize that in this environment of emergency, those things don't matter now. Right? And so this is that process that we're trying to build here, that in the event of an emergency, our team works together in unity for the national good. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.